Caitlin Bell had $214 folded in her apron pocket, and a mother who needed dialysis 3 days a week. She scrubbed floors in the biggest house in Newport, Rhode Island, and she kept her head down the way poor people learn to keep it down. Then one evening, she walked into that glass-walled living room, looked straight at the most dangerous man in New England, and asked him to marry her. Santino Ferraro was 38 years old. He ran 5 ports, 4 unions, and a family name that made grown men lower their voices in restaurants. He almost never raised his own. In 7 years, nobody who worked for him had ever heard him shout, and that's exactly why they were afraid of him. He kept his word, the way other men kept weapons, and once he'd made up his mind, no one alive had ever changed it. She wasn't offering him love, she was offering him a deal, and she'd rehearsed every line of it for 3 nights straight. But she'd gotten one thing wrong, and he'd know it the second she said it. There was only one condition she wouldn't bend on, and it had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with the old woman washing dishes in his kitchen. Santino didn't answer right away. He opened his mouth to speak, and that's the exact moment the glass wall behind her came apart. What he did in the 90 seconds that followed, and what she did when it was over, would change the rest of both their lives. If you're the kind of person who stays for stories about dignity, sacrifice, and what we're willing to risk for the people who raised us, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who'd understand, and subscribe, because you're going to want to be here for what comes next. Now let's go back to the day Caitlin Bell first walked through the gates of the Ferraro estate. The iron gates of the Ferraro estate opened on a March morning, while the wind off Narragansett Bay still cut bitterly through the rows of bare trees lining Bellevue. Caitlin Bell stepped down from the staffing company's van, one arm wrapped around her work bag, the other steadying her mother by the elbow. The company manager had warned her 3 separate times that this house paid twice the going rate, and that anyone who ruined a job here shouldn't expect to find another position anywhere in Newport. Caitlin had nodded without asking why. She'd learned long ago that poor people didn't ask why. Poor people only asked what time the shift started. Waiting to meet them was a tall old man, with a slight stoop and snow-white hair combed neatly back from his face. He introduced himself as Walter Quinn, the butler, and told her he'd been working in this house since before Caitlin was born. He led her through the ground floor, speaking in the flat, measured voice of a man reciting something he'd repeated 1,000 times. 3 rules, he said. First, never enter the study, even if the door is open, even if someone tells you to go inside. Second, don't touch any telephone in the house, not even to dust it, not even when it's ringing. Third, and here he paused longer than he had for the first 2, don't ask questions. Don't ask who just arrived, don't ask who just left, don't ask why there are nights when every light on the 2nd floor stays on until 4 o'clock in the morning. Caitlin asked whether there was a 4th rule. The old man looked at her, and for the first time that morning, one corner of his mouth lifted. Yes, he said. The 4th rule is, don't try to remember the first 3 by writing them down. The interview took place in the kitchen and lasted exactly 7 minutes. Walter set her application on the wooden table and asked for her permanent address. Caitlin gave him the name of an apartment complex in Pawtucket she'd moved out of 11 months earlier. He asked about the family member living with her. She said her mother had come with her, that she was 63, still healthy, able to help in the kitchen, wash dishes, work long shifts if necessary. She said it very quickly, faster than anything else she'd said that morning, and she heard her own voice catch for half a beat on the word healthy. Walter didn't ask again. He simply wrote something on the paper and folded it in half. At that moment, the kitchen door opened, and Helen Marchetti came in, one hand braced on a 4-legged aluminum cane, the other gripping the doorframe. It took her nearly a full minute to cross the roughly 10 feet from the doorway to the dining table. Caitlin started to rise, then sat back down because she knew there was nothing her mother hated more than being helped in front of strangers. The entire kitchen fell silent. Walter Quinn watched the older woman walk. He watched the way she shifted her weight onto her left leg, watched the way her hand clutched the back of the chair before she lowered herself into it. He watched longer than politeness allowed, long enough for Caitlin to feel the blood rushing into her face and begin thinking about the second lie she might have to tell, but he didn't ask anything. He simply reached for the plastic basket of garlic on the shelf, placed it in front of Helen, and slid an empty bowl beside it. Just sit and peel the garlic, he said. No one here is counting your hours. Helen looked up at him, then picked up the first bulb of garlic. Caitlin turned her face away and pretended to look out the window. The staff room was in the east wing, with 2 narrow beds, a wooden wardrobe, and an electric wall heater with an orange dial. On the first night, the temperature outside dropped below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and Caitlin lay there listening to the wind batter the window frame for 2 full hours without reaching for that dial. She didn't know how the electricity was charged here, didn't know whether someone kept track of it, and she had no intention of letting her first month's wages be docked for something she could endure. She spread her coat over her mother's legs, then sat up, turned on the bedside lamp, and took a spool of thread and a pair of wool socks with worn heels from her bag. She mended them with short, dense stitches, the kind of stitching done by someone who knew those socks would have to survive one more winter. When she was finished, she opened her wallet, poured every last coin onto the table, and counted them for the 3rd time that day, not because she'd forgotten the amount, but because counting was the only thing she still had control over. Then she divided the money into 3 portions, wrapped each one in a separate piece of paper, and hid them in 3 different places inside the suitcase. The next morning, she was awake at 5 o'clock, and by the time Walter Quinn came down to the kitchen at 5:15, the entire ground floor was gleaming. He stood at the foot of the stairs for a moment, looked at the hardwood floor, then looked at her. "You've only been here 1 day," he said. "Don't work as if they're going to throw you out tomorrow." Caitlin tightened her grip around the mop handle and answered that she was only finishing the work that needed to be done. Walter nodded, poured coffee into 2 cups, pushed one toward her, and said nothing more. It was the first day of 8 months that would change everything, and Caitlin Bell still hadn't laid eyes on the owner of the house. Caitlin met the owner of the house for the first time during her 2nd week, but before that, she had already heard about him in the way people hear that the weather is about to change. She heard it in the lowered voices of the 2 gardeners whenever a car came through the gates. She heard it in the way Walter Quinn suddenly changed the dining room tablecloth one Thursday afternoon without offering any explanation. And she heard it most clearly on the night 4 men came for dinner. One of them, a man around 50, with a flushed face who laughed louder than anyone else at the table and sweated more than all the others combined. Caitlin had been assigned to carry dishes in and out. She heard that the man managed 3 restaurants in Providence. She heard that for 2 years, the books from those 3 restaurants had been short exactly $60,000. And she heard that the man seated at the head of the table, Santino Ferraro, never mentioned that number once during the entire meal. He asked about the man's wife. He asked about his oldest daughter, who was about to start college. He offered him a 2nd serving of fish, and when the man refused because he couldn't swallow another bite, Santino still ordered another portion for him. Dinner lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. Santino finished everything on his plate without leaving a single piece behind. Then he set his knife and fork down side by side, lifted his napkin to his mouth, folded it in half, and placed it to the left of his plate. The entire table went silent. "You have 12 hours to say goodbye to this city," he said. That was all. Not one word spoken louder than the voice he'd used to order the fish. The red-faced man stood up and pushed his chair back, and from nearly 10 feet away, Caitlin saw his knees buckle for half a second before he managed to catch himself against the back of the chair. He didn't beg. He only said thank you, twice, and then walked out the door. Caitlin cleared the table after everyone had gone. She picked up the napkin. Santino had folded in half, and for one brief second, she understood why Walter Quinn had warned her not to ask questions. The following week, there was another dinner, larger and louder than the first. One of the younger men who arrived with the guests had slicked back hair and a watch wider than his wrist, and when a waitress spilled a little wine onto the tablecloth, he swung his hand across her face. The slap cracked through a dining room with a ceiling nearly 13 feet high, and the sound seemed to hang there longer than it had any right to. The waitress stood frozen, still holding the wine bottle in her hand. Santino Ferraro set down his glass. He rose, walked around the table, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for something bigger. But he only bent down, picked up a shard of broken glass near the young woman's feet, placed it on her tray, and turned toward the younger man. "Apologize to her," he said. The man stammered something about the girl ruining the tablecloth. Santino didn't repeat himself. He simply waited. He waited so long that the young man finally had to turn to the waitress and apologize in front of 22 people. Then Santino held out his hand. "Car keys," he said. "You're walking home." Newport to Providence was more than 25 miles. The young man placed the keys in Santino's palm and walked out of the room, and no one at that dinner said another word about what had just happened. Caitlin stood in the kitchen doorway and didn't look away. She'd seen every kind of man during the 3 years she'd spent running. Men who shouted, threatened, and hit people when they were angry. She had never seen a man make someone walk more than 25 miles without ever changing the tone of his voice. 2 days later, she met him in the ground floor hallway. He was coming out of the study with 2 men behind him. Caitlin was pushing a cart loaded with clean linens, and she managed to step aside in time. Every member of the household staff standing in the corridor lowered their head at the exact same moment, like some shared reflex no one had ever needed to teach. And for that half second, she was the only person left with her face raised. She hadn't meant to do it. She simply hadn't known that people were expected to bow their heads in this house. Santino Ferraro passed her, then stopped, only for half a second, so briefly that the two men walking behind him didn't realize in time and nearly collided with his back. He looked at her once. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask who she was. He showed neither irritation nor amusement. Then he kept walking. That afternoon, Walter Quinn found her folding linens in the laundry room and stood in the doorway for a long moment. "You didn't lower your head," he said. Caitlin answered that she'd remember next time. Walter shook his head, and there was something in his voice she couldn't understand. "I didn't tell you to remember," he said. "I only said that you didn't lower your head." Then he turned away, and somewhere below them in the kitchen, the sound of her mother's cane struck the floor in a slow, steady rhythm, like a clock counting down toward something no one in that house could yet see. That ticking countdown stopped on a morning near the end of May. Caitlin was wiping down the dining room windows when she heard something fall in the kitchen. Not the sound of a dish breaking, but something heavier, shorter. The sound of something with no hands to catch itself. She ran in and found her mother lying on her side beside the table, the basket of garlic overturned on the floor, half-peeled cloves scattered across the tile. Helen came around after about 40 seconds, and the first thing she asked was whether anyone had seen her. Caitlin said no one had. She lied. The kitchen assistant was standing right by the back door, and by noon, everyone below stairs knew that the old woman who peeled garlic had fallen. That afternoon, Caitlin asked for 2 hours off and took her mother to a clinic in Providence. The doctor told her the same things she had heard 11 months earlier at another clinic, except this time he said them in the voice of a man whose patience was nearly gone. The current treatment plan was no longer enough. Her mother needed to move to a new schedule, needed additional medication, needed to be monitored 3 times a week instead of twice. Then he asked the same question every clinic in America asked: why a patient with end-stage renal disease like her had no Medicare coverage when, in this country, patients with end-stage renal disease qualified for federal insurance regardless of age. Caitlin sat in silence. Her mother's paperwork had been submitted 3 times in 3 years, and suspended all 3 times, because the person filing it for her was a woman named Caitlin Bell, and Caitlin Bell had no real social security number, no permanent address she could keep for longer than 4 months. The name that had kept the two of them alive for 3 years was the very same name that had locked her mother outside every door. Caitlin told the doctor she would take care of it. He handed her a sheet of paper listing the deposit required before the new treatment could begin, and Caitlin folded it into quarters before she could finish reading the amount. That night, she called the staffing company and asked for 1 month's wages in advance. The person on the other end of the line took less than 20 seconds to answer. Company policy required employees to complete 6 months before they could even be considered for an advance. Caitlin said she had worked 2 months. The person said yes, that was right. She had worked 2 months, then hung up. Caitlin sat on the bed in the staff room, listening to her mother breathe in the bed beside her, and opened her wallet. She took the 3 paper bundles from 3 different places in the suitcase, opened each one, and arranged the money in 3 rows across the blanket. She counted it once. Then she gathered it together and counted it a second time, more slowly, as though the second count might somehow produce a different answer. It didn't. She sat that way for a long time, both hands resting on the small pile of money, until Helen shifted in bed and asked through the darkness if she was still awake. Caitlin said she was folding clothes. Then she turned off the bedside lamp, lay down, and stared at the ceiling with her eyes open until after 2 o'clock in the morning. At that hour, she sat up. Barefoot, she walked into the west hallway, where a glass display cabinet was built into the wall between 2 windows. She had cleaned that cabinet 11 times in 2 months, and knew every object inside it. On the left were several old badges. On the right was a velvet tray holding the jewelry of a woman who had died long ago, the mother of the man who owned the house, something Walter Quinn cleaned himself once a month with a soft cloth, and never allowed anyone else to touch. Caitlin stood in front of the glass for about 3 minutes without reaching out. She could see her own reflection there, dim and shadowed, and she turned her face away so she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. Then she opened the cabinet door. The hinge gave a very small creak, and she stood motionless for 10 seconds, waiting to see if anyone would turn on a light. No one did. There were 7 pieces on the tray. In the center lay a necklace, set with blue stones, the largest and brightest piece there. And if she took it, she and her mother could live for half a year. Caitlin looked at it longer than she looked at anything else. Then she reached in and took the smallest thing on the tray, a leaf-shaped brooch less than 2 inches long, hidden in the farthest corner. The kind of thing that might take some time for anyone to notice was missing, unless they counted. Her hand trembled so badly that the brooch struck the edge of the tray with a faint click. She closed the cabinet, wiped her fingerprints from the glass with the hem of her nightgown, then walked back toward the staff room, still barefoot, without turning on a single light. The next morning she got up at 5 o'clock, as she did every day, finished cleaning the entire ground floor before 5:15, and when Walter Quinn came down to the kitchen and poured coffee into 2 cups, she was already holding hers in both hands, so he wouldn't see them shaking. Walter Quinn cleaned the glass cabinet in the west hallway on Saturday morning, once a month, and that month it happened to fall exactly 3 days later. He opened the cabinet door, lifted out the velvet tray, and counted. He didn't tell anyone. By noon, Santino Ferraro knew. He didn't call the police. He didn't send anyone downstairs to search the staff room. Didn't ask who had been in the hallway on which night. Didn't change the locks. He asked for only one thing, that someone check every pawnshop in the state. In Rhode Island, every pawnshop was required to photograph the person bringing an item in, copy their identification, and upload everything to a database the state police could access within 24 hours. They found the leaf-shaped brooch at a shop on Broad Street in Providence before dark. The attached photograph showed a 27-year-old woman with her hair tied at the nape of her neck, wearing a thin coat, looking straight into the camera with the expression of someone who had already calculated that she would be seen. The identification gave the name Caitlin Bell. The amount she had received was $900. Santino drove himself to the shop that Sunday afternoon. The owner handed him the receipt and said she hadn't bargained once, that he had offered $900 and she had nodded immediately, and that he had asked her twice if she was sure. Santino held the receipt, looked at the line naming the item, then asked what else he knew. The shop owner said she had asked for directions to the nearest hospital with a dialysis unit. At 7 o'clock that evening, Santino didn't return to Newport. His car stopped in the parking lot of an outpatient dialysis center on Chalkstone Avenue, and he sat inside until nearly 11 o'clock at night, without getting out, without calling anyone. At 5 minutes to 11, he opened the car door. The first-floor hallway was almost empty, lit by cold white fluorescent lights, with 2 rows of blue plastic chairs bolted together by metal bars. Caitlin Bell sat in the third seat from the end, her head tilted to one side against the wall, one hand still holding the strap of the canvas bag resting in her lap. No one knew how long she had been sleeping like that, but the shoes on her feet still carried mud from the Newport garden that morning. Santino stood 4 steps away and didn't wake her. He waited until a door at the far end of the hallway opened, and the sound startled her awake. She saw him, and for about 3 seconds, she didn't move at all. Then she sat up straight, placed both feet on the floor, and waited. He didn't ask why. He said only one sentence, his voice as even as it had been the night he ordered fish for the restaurant manager. "You took something that belonged to my mother." Caitlin said yes. He asked if she knew how much the brooch was worth. She said no. He said $40,000. "You sold it for $900. Caitlin didn't lift her eyes from the floor. $900 was enough for this week, she said. Santino stood still. He asked how she planned to pay it back. Caitlin raised a hand to the strap of her bag and held it there for a moment. Then she opened the bag and placed it on the chair, turning the opening toward him so he could look for himself. There was no money inside. There were 3 bottles of medication with the patient's name still printed on the labels, a sheet of paper showing appointments 3 days a week through June and July, a small folded sweater, and a plastic container with an opened sleeve of saltine crackers. There was nothing else. Santino looked inside longer than necessary. He read the name on the medication label, Helen Marchetti, and he didn't ask why the older woman's last name wasn't Bell. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He didn't say that he understood, didn't say that he was sorry, didn't say that she should have come to him first. He simply took out his phone, stepped 3 paces to the side, and made a call. The call lasted about 40 seconds. He gave the patient's name, gave the name of the center, and said only one thing about the rest: pay everything. The balance already owed, the new treatment plan, the medication, all of it, and send the bill to the office. Then he ended the call and slipped the phone into his inside pocket. Caitlin stood up too quickly and had to grab the back of the chair. She said she would pay him back. She said she would work extra night shifts. She would sign papers to have it taken from her wages for as many years as it took. She would. Santino cut her off by turning toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. "I already bought the brooch back," he said without turning around. Not because of you, because it belonged to my mother. Then he walked outside. Caitlin stood alone in that white hallway, one hand still clenched around the strap of the canvas bag, and for 2 full minutes, she waited to see if someone would come back and tell her to pack her things and leave Newport that very night. No one came back. Out in the parking lot, Santino Ferraro sat in his car for a while longer before starting the engine. He had spent 2 days looking for a thief, and he had found exactly the person he needed to find. The right pawn shop, the right amount of money, the right face in the photograph. The only thing was that what he found in that hallway that night wasn't a thief. The name on the medication label was the one thing Santino Ferraro brought back to Newport with him that night. The next morning, he asked one of his people to look into a name, and it took them less than 2 days to bring him a file so thin it was almost empty. Caitlin Bell had a Rhode Island driver's license issued 3 years and 2 months earlier. She had a bank account opened 2 years and 7 months earlier, and the balance had never gone above $400. She had 3 short-term employment contracts through staffing agencies, all within those same 3 years. Before that point, there was nothing. No tax return had ever been filed under that name before that year. No previous driver's license in any state. No school records. No photograph in any high school yearbook anywhere in New England. Not a single image on the internet that matched the face in the pawnshop photograph. A 27-year-old woman whose entire existence under that name had begun out of nowhere just 3 years ago, leaving her first 24 years completely blank on American soil. He read the entire file in 7 minutes, then set it down on the desk and sat in silence for a very long time. That afternoon, Walter Quinn came to the laundry room and told Caitlin that the master wanted to see her in the study. She took off her apron, hung it on a hook, and as she walked there, she remembered the first rule Walter himself had taught her on her first day, that she was never to enter that room, even if someone told her to go inside. The door was already open. Santino sat behind the desk with the file face down in front of him. He didn't invite her to sit. He asked where she had been born. She said Woonsocket. He asked which high school she had attended. She gave him a name. He asked what her father had done for a living. She said he had died when she was young and had worked as a plumber. He asked why her mother's last name was Marchetti, while hers was Bell. Caitlin said Bell was her father's name. She answered all 4 questions in an even voice, neither faster nor slower than usual, and she looked directly at him through every one of them, and that was exactly what made Santino certain that all 4 answers were lies. No one telling the truth could hold another person's gaze that calmly while being questioned about their own father. He didn't challenge a single answer. He didn't open the file. He simply sat there for about 10 seconds, then told her that he owed no one, and kept no one, that her mother's medical expenses had been paid in full through the end of August, and he wouldn't ask for a single dollar back, and that tomorrow morning she and her mother would leave. He said it once and didn't repeat himself. Caitlin stood still. She didn't ask why. She didn't say that her mother could barely travel any distance. She didn't mention that the new treatment plan had only begun 2 weeks earlier. Didn't mention that she had worked there for 2 months and 10 days without missing a single shift. Didn't mention that if they left Newport, the address on her mother's medical records would become meaningless for the 4th time in 3 years. She only said, "Thank you, sir." Then she turned, walked out, and closed the study door so gently that Santino never heard the latch catch. He remained in that room until after 11 o'clock that night. Many people had stood in the exact place where she had been standing during the past 7 years. Some had cried. Some had talked about their wives and children. Some had dropped to their knees. Once, a man had taken Santino's hand and kissed it, and Santino still remembered the contempt he had felt then, how quickly and cleanly it had come, and how easy it had made everything afterward. The woman that afternoon had done none of those things. She had said thank you, as if he had given her something. He rose, walked out to the west hallway, opened the glass cabinet, and looked at the leaf-shaped brooch resting once again in its proper place on the velvet tray. He didn't understand why he had come out there to look at it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he was still awake. At 3 o'clock, he heard the 4-legged cane moving very slowly along the ground floor hallway. One tap, then another, then silence. They were packing their things. In the staff room in the east wing, Caitlin Bell placed 3 bottles of medication inside the lining of the suitcase, and at the very bottom, beneath fabric that had been sewn back together with short, dense stitches, there was a yellow envelope browned at the corners that she had carried with her for 3 years and had never allowed anyone to see. She laid her clothes over it, zipped the suitcase shut, then sat on the edge of the bed and waited for daylight. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, every light along the driveway and both lamps on the gateposts of the Ferraro estate went out at the same time. Inside the house, the hallway lights were still on, the heater was still running. The electric clock on the kitchen wall was still blinking the correct time. The power had not gone out. At 5:15 in the morning, mother and daughter stood outside the gates of the Ferraro estate with 2 suitcases at their feet. Caitlin had booked the cheapest ride she could find through a car service app, scheduled for 5:30, with the Providence bus terminal as the destination. Dawn hadn't fully broken yet. Bellevue was empty, and Caitlin only noticed something unusual after they had been standing there for about 2 minutes. That the 2 lamps on the gate posts behind her were completely dark, while through the iron bars she could still see the hallway lights glowing inside the house. She hadn't finished thinking it through when a wash of light swept across the road. It wasn't 1 car. It was 2, traveling close together, their lights going dark as they entered the bend. Then both sets of headlights snapping on at the same moment when they were still about 130 feet away. Harsh white beams aimed directly at the 2 women standing beside the road. The vehicles stopped across their path, one in front, one behind. Neither car had license plates. Caitlin did exactly what she had rehearsed in her mind for 3 years, without ever having to use it. She stepped forward and put herself between her mother and the road. She heard car doors open. She heard shoes against the pavement. More than 2 men, fewer than 6. One man called out the name she had been carrying for the past 3 years, and then another voice called her real name. The name no one had spoken since the spring 3 years earlier, and it was that second voice that made her knees go weak. Helen Marchetti heard the approaching footsteps and did the only thing she was still capable of doing. She pulled her daughter back behind her. The 4-legged aluminum cane slipped on the edge of the curb. Helen fell sideways, her shoulder striking the suitcase. Caitlin turned, dropped to her knees beside her mother, and didn't have time to see what happened next. She only heard it. She heard the iron gates behind them opening, not quickly, without a screech. She heard footsteps coming out from the grounds, more of them than there were on the road. She heard someone say one very short sentence in a voice no louder than someone asking for the time. Then she heard sounds she wouldn't tell anyone about for many years afterward, and the entire thing lasted only a little more than 20 seconds, less time than it took her to help her mother sit upright. When she finally looked up, the 2 cars without plates were already backing out of the bend and disappearing toward the east, and the only thing left on the pavement in front of the gate was the aluminum cane lying on its side. Santino Ferraro stood 3 steps away. He didn't say a word to the men who had just withdrawn, didn't ask who had called that name, didn't turn toward his own people to give another order. He looked at the cane on the ground first. Then he walked over, bent down, picked it up, and brushed the road dust from all 4 rubber feet with the palm of his hand. Then he lowered himself onto one knee on the dew-damp pavement beside the older woman. He didn't help her stand immediately. He placed the cane back into her hand first, let her close her fingers around it herself, then slipped his hand beneath her elbow. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he asked. Helen said no, though her voice was still trembling. He asked again, more slowly this time, and she admitted that her shoulder felt a little numb. Santino nodded, helped her to her feet with both hands, waited until she was completely steady before letting go, and he didn't release her any sooner, even when she told him she was all right. The entire process took nearly a minute, 3 times longer than what had just happened out on the road. Caitlin watched him and forgot even to brush the dirt from her own knees. During the 2 months and 10 days she had spent in that house, she had seen this man send someone out of the city with a single sentence, had seen him make another man walk more than 25 miles because of 1 slap. She had never seen him kneel before anyone. He turned toward her. "Take your mother inside," he said. Caitlin didn't move. "You fired me," she said. Santino looked at her, and in the wash of headlights still coming from his own car parked inside the grounds, not a single feature of his face changed. "I fired you," he said. "I didn't hand you over to anyone. Those are 2 different things." Then he picked up both suitcases, one in each hand, and walked back into the grounds without turning to see whether the 2 women were following. Caitlin helped her mother across the threshold of the iron gates for the 2nd time in her life, and this time she understood that she had stepped into something she would no longer be able to walk out of on her own. Behind them, the 2 lamps on the gateposts came back on at the same moment, as though no one had ever touched them. Elliot Vance arrived in Newport at 9 o'clock that morning, 3 hours earlier than his usual weekly appointment. He was 45 years old, had served as an advisor to the Ferraro family for 7 years, and in all those 7 years he had never once arrived early. He sat down in the chair across from the desk in the study, placed his briefcase on the floor instead of on the desk, and began by saying that he had heard what happened outside the gates before dawn. Santino neither confirmed nor denied it. Vance went on to say that the 2 cars had come from Boston, that the men inside them weren't the kind who took it upon themselves to handle private business, and that this meant someone in Boston wanted something currently inside this house. He said that in 7 years he had never seen Santino allow someone else's trouble to touch the front door of his home, and that this time it had. Santino asked what he was trying to say. Vance sat up straighter and said what he had come prepared to say. "Give the girl to them," he said. "In return, you demand the Providence port route. All of it. They need this badly enough that they'll give you even that, and you know they will." He added that this wasn't a question of morality but arithmetic, that a contract worker supplied through a staffing company who had been here for 2 months and 10 days wasn't worth trading for a war with Boston, and that if Santino wanted to preserve appearances, Vance could arrange everything himself, so no one would ever know he had agreed. Santino let him finish. Then he stood, walked to the study window, and looked down into the rear courtyard, where Caitlin Bell was on her knees scrubbing the stone steps with both hands, and he called Vance over. "Keep looking at the hands of that woman cleaning the steps," he said. "Then tell me again who is worth more." Vance stood beside the window for about 5 seconds, then stepped back and said he understood, that he had only been doing his job as an advisor by presenting an option, and that if Santino had already made his decision, then he had nothing more to say. He said it in the voice of a man who had known one thing very well for 7 years, that once this man made up his mind, no one on earth could change it. Before Vance bent down to pick up his briefcase, Santino added one more thing. "The older woman in the kitchen has the last name Marchetti," he said. "Her daughter doesn't. Have someone find out whether anyone in Providence used that name before." Vance's hand, already reaching for the handle of the briefcase, stopped. Half a second, no more. Then he picked it up, tucked it beneath his arm, and said he would have someone ask around. The sentence came out smoothly, without a stumble, and he left the study at his usual pace. That afternoon, Walter Quinn brought up tea and stayed longer than he normally did. He didn't ask why the mother and daughter had been allowed to remain, didn't ask about what happened before dawn, didn't ask who had turned off the 2 lamps on the gateposts. He only said that he had been in this house for 42 years, had served Santino's father, and in those 42 years, there was only one person on the council he had ever truly feared. Santino asked who. Walter said Arthur Sable. He set the teacup down and said that here in New England there were 5 branches: Providence, Boston, Hartford, Springfield, and New Haven, and all 5 did things none of them would ever dare tell their wives about. But 4 branches buy goods, he said. Arthur Sable buys people. He told Santino that when he was still young, Sable had once paid a family in Fall River to take their daughter away to work in one of his hotels, and everyone called it an employment contract, and that girl worked there for 11 years before no one heard from her again. He said Sable was 62 years old, dressed impeccably, attended church regularly, had never raised his voice at anyone, and that was exactly why the other 4 branches had left him alone for 30 years. Then Walter said one last thing before carrying the tray away. "He never asks for anything unless he is willing to pay more for it than anyone else," he said. "Remember that. When a man like that offers something large in exchange for something small, then the small thing isn't small at all." Santino remained in the study until after dark. In the rear courtyard below, the 27-year-old woman had finished scrubbing the steps and was pouring the dirty water from the basin into the drain, and he realized that he had stood at this same window twice in one day to watch the exact same thing. 3 days later, Walter Quinn announced in the kitchen that he would be cooking dinner, and that anyone who objected was welcome to go hungry. He closed the upstairs kitchen, sent the 2 kitchen assistants home early, then set the pots on the stove with the solemn air of a man who knew perfectly well that he was arranging an excuse. That excuse had a name: Helen Marchetti. Ever since the fall outside the gate, the older woman had done little but sit in her room, and Walter had counted exactly 3 days before deciding that what she needed wasn't more medicine, but a table with people sitting around it. He moved the staff dining table into the middle of the kitchen, spread a cloth over it, and set out 4 places. Caitlin looked at the 4th setting and asked who he intended to invite. Walter said the boy had been eating alone for 17 years, and tonight he wasn't going to. Santino Ferraro came down to the kitchen at 7 o'clock, still wearing the shirt he had worn all day, and took the chair nearest the door without asking why he had been called there. Dinner was stew, bread, and a bottle of wine that Walter opened and poured for himself in an amount greater than everyone else's combined. Halfway through the meal, he began to tell a story. He said there had once been a very well-behaved 8-year-old boy in this house, so well-behaved that people sometimes thought he couldn't speak. He said that one year a family from Newport came to visit and brought along an 11-year-old boy, and that boy stood in the middle of the front yard, pointed at Walter, and called him an old servant. Walter paused, took a drink, then said he hadn't even had time to turn around before he heard one clean sound. And when he looked down, the 11-year-old was sitting on the ground clutching his nose, while the 8-year-old stood there with his fist still clenched, and not a single expression changed on his face. Helen asked what happened after that. Walter said the boy's father punished him by making him stand facing the wall for 2 hours. He said he had secretly brought the boy a piece of cake, and the boy hadn't eaten it, only asked Walter whether he was hurt. Then Walter pointed across the table and said that 30 years later, that same boy still hadn't apologized once for making him scrub blood off the courtyard. Santino sat in silence. He didn't smile, didn't argue, didn't say that it hadn't happened that way. He simply reached for another slice of bread and kept eating. And that silence was what made everyone at the table laugh, including Caitlin, and the sound of her own laughter startled her, because it had been so long since she had made that sound. Helen said she had a story too. She told them that when she was 22, she worked as a secretary at an insurance company on Westminster Street, and the owner had a habit of dictating numbers to her very quickly, just to see whether she could keep up. She said she kept up for 2 full years, and on the day she resigned, he admitted that he had been reading them quickly on purpose, because he wanted an excuse to make her stay late. Walter asked whether she had stayed. Helen said yes, then added that she married him. The whole table laughed again. Caitlin looked at her mother and realized that in the past 3 years, this was the first time Helen had told a story that included her husband, without lowering her voice at the end. Dinner lasted until nearly 9 o'clock. Walter told another story about planting tomatoes in the corner of the back garden the previous year, and having the birds eat every one of them, and said he had built a scarecrow wearing one of the master's old suits, and after that the birds never came back, though he wasn't sure whether it was because of the scarecrow or the suit. Santino said that was the suit he had still been looking for. Walter told him to look in the back corner of the garden because it was still standing there. When it was time to clear the table, Santino stood first, picked up his own plate, and Helen's, carried them to the sink, set them down, then went upstairs without saying anything more. Walter watched him go, and made no comment at all. Caitlin washed the dishes while her mother stood beside her, drying them. Helen worked very slowly, taking nearly a minute with each plate, but she refused to sit down. Halfway through the stack, she spoke quietly, just loud enough for her daughter to hear. "You pay attention," she said. "The way a person treats the people who serve them tells you exactly who they really are." Caitlin didn't turn around. She asked her mother why she was saying that now. Helen said that while Caitlin's father was still alive, she had met plenty of people who wore expensive clothes, and she had never seen one of them remember the name of the person clearing their table. Then she set down the dish towel, picked up her cane, and said she was sleepy. Caitlin stayed alone in the kitchen for another 15 minutes, washed the remaining pots, put the 4 sets of silverware back into the drawer, turned off the stove, and checked the back door latch the way she had out of habit for the past 3 years. When she switched off the kitchen light, she heard footsteps on the 2nd floor, moving from one end of the hallway to the other, stopping, then turning and coming back. That man wasn't asleep either. She stood in the darkness listening to those footsteps for a long time, then went back to her room, and that night was the first night in 3 years that she slept without leaving her suitcase packed beside the bed. The invitation arrived on Tuesday morning, written by hand on a thick card and sent through the mail rather than by telephone. Arthur Sable invited Santino Ferraro to lunch at a private club in Boston's Back Bay, and on the final line of the card, he added that he was very much looking forward to seeing him again, that the last time the two of them had sat at the same table was at Santino's father's funeral 17 years earlier. Elliot Vance said he shouldn't go. Santino went. The club stood on Commonwealth Avenue, with oak doors and a doorman in a long coat, and inside it was so quiet that you could hear a knife touch a plate at a table more than 30 feet away. Arthur Sable rose when Santino entered, extended his hand first, and held Santino's grip for 1 beat longer than necessary. He was 62 years old, his hair combed straight back, his tie drawn tight against his collar, and throughout the entire meal he never once rested an elbow on the table. He asked about the house in Newport. He asked whether the west roof had been replaced yet, and said that when Santino's father was alive, that roof used to leak every November. He asked whether Mr. Quinn was still well, and when Santino said the old man still grew tomatoes in the backyard himself, Sable smiled and said that decent people were given long lives by heaven, while men like the two of them had to look after themselves. By the second course, he still hadn't mentioned why they were there. Only after the server cleared away the plates did he place his knife and fork side by side, fold his napkin, and say that he wouldn't waste Santino's time. He said he knew there was a woman in Santino's house with the last name Marchetti. He said he knew her father had died 3 years earlier, in an underground parking garage in Providence. And he said he knew the man had sent something away before he died. Santino asked what he needed it for. Sable answered directly. So directly that the honesty itself was the most frightening thing about that lunch. He said that for 10 years, the Boston branch's true revenue had been higher than the number he reported to the council, and that the only person in the world who had ever seen both figures side by side was Paul Marchetti. He said that if the other 4 branches found out, it would no longer be a matter of money but a matter of law. And Santino knew the laws of the council better than he did. Then he said the sentence he had prepared. "Give me the girl," he said. "In return, the entire Providence port route is yours." Santino didn't answer immediately. He sat still for about 5 seconds, and during those 5 seconds, he heard those exact words again inside his head, one by one, spoken in the study of his own house 11 days earlier by another man, not something close to them. The exact words, "That won't happen, Mr. Sable," he said. Nothing more. Arthur Sable didn't look surprised. He poured more water for Santino before pouring any for himself, then asked whether Santino knew that for 30 years he had always paid the highest price on the council. Santino said he had heard. "Sable," said Mr. "Quinn told you that, didn't he?" And he laughed, then said Mr. Quinn had told the story correctly, that the girl in Fall River all those years ago had been real, that her family had signed the papers, and that everything had been legal on paper. He said people sold their own children more often than Santino imagined, and that he was merely the only man honest enough to call the transaction by its proper name. Santino said he didn't buy people. Sable looked at him for a moment, then said that Santino's father had once said the same thing, and that he still remembered it because it was the only thing the man had ever said that Sable didn't believe. The server brought coffee. Sable stirred the sugar 3 times, set the spoon down, and offered his final words in the tone of a man giving sincere advice. "You think you're protecting a woman?" he said. "You're protecting a bomb, and you don't even know where the fuse is." He told Santino to think about it. For 3 years she had been running, had changed where she lived 9 times, had even changed her name, and not once had anyone managed to catch her. He asked whether Santino had ever wondered why a 27-year-old woman who cleaned houses was so good at disappearing, and whether he had ever wondered why, out of all 5 New England branches, she had ended up working in his house. Santino stood and thanked him for lunch. Sable stood as well, shook his hand again, and walked him all the way to the oak doors. And he did it with such courtesy that the doorman bowed to both of them. On the drive back to Newport, the car followed the South Shore for more than an hour, and Santino didn't say a single word to the driver. He wasn't thinking about the bomb. He was thinking about the fact that 2 men more than 43 miles apart, without ever arranging it between themselves, had spoken the exact same sentence, in the exact same order, for the exact same price. By the time he reached home, darkness had fallen. The kitchen light was still on. Caitlin Bell was sitting at the staff dining table, an open leather-bound notebook in front of her at page 43, and she was copying each number into a school notebook, writing very slowly, as though, if she put them down in her own hand, they might finally agree to tell her something. Caitlin heard the entire conversation in the study the following evening, not because she was eavesdropping, but because she was cleaning the hallway outside, and the door had been left open by about the width of a hand. She heard Elliot Vance ask what price Sable had offered. She heard Santino tell him. She heard Vance say that if Boston was willing to give up the entire Providence port route, then it meant they were willing to pay even more than that, and that next time they wouldn't send 2 cars, they would send more, and that whatever came next wouldn't stop at the gates of the house. Caitlin stood in the hallway with the cleaning cloth in her hand, and she did the one thing she had become very good at over the past 3 years. She calculated. She calculated that as long as she remained in this house, everything they were after would remain in this house. She calculated that her mother couldn't survive another long bus ride. She calculated that the safest place in America for a 63-year-old woman right now was the very place the people hunting her daughter wanted her to leave. And she calculated that if they needed her and not her mother, then the fastest way to keep Helen there was to take herself somewhere else. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she left the staff room without her suitcase, carrying only the canvas bag and the leather-bound notebook hidden inside the lining of her coat. She looked toward the other bed, where her mother was sleeping with her face turned toward the wall, then closed the door as quietly as she could. On the kitchen table, she left a piece of paper torn from the school notebook, with exactly 2 lines written in the neat handwriting of someone who had written them out 3 times before settling on the final version. "You've already paid more than enough," Please keep my mother here for another 6 months. She walked a little over half a mile to the main road and caught the earliest bus to Boston. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Walter Quinn found the note. At 7:10, Santino Ferraro read it. He said nothing for nearly half a minute, then folded the paper, slipped it into his breast pocket, and told them to prepare the car. Vance said he needed to take at least 10 men. Santino took 3. They found her close to 4 o'clock that afternoon, in a row of abandoned warehouses in South Boston near the water, where decades earlier there had once been a container yard, and now there were only rusting sheet metal roofs. Boston's men had picked her up at the bus station around noon. The rolling door of the third warehouse was raised about 3 feet off the ground. There was yellow light inside. There were voices, and there was the sound of a man laughing. Roland Sable was 55 years old, Arthur Sable's younger brother, and he was the kind of man his brother had spent 30 years cleaning up after. He didn't care about the notebook. He had sent 2 of his men outside to stand guard, and he was walking toward the iron chair in the middle of the warehouse, telling her as he came that his brother wanted her untouched, but his brother was in Back Bay. He never finished the sentence. A single sharp blast cracked through the sheet metal warehouse, short and clean, echoing 3 times before dying away. The rolling door came down. When it opened again, Santino Ferraro walked out, and the man who had been laughing inside did not. In the corner of the concrete yard outside, a man around 55 sat with his back against a truck tire, breathing heavily, one hand pressed against his side. He was one of the men who had come with the Boston group, a hired debt collector named Frank Doyle. He watched Santino approach and didn't beg. He only watched. Santino stopped in front of him for 3 seconds. Then he turned toward the young man standing frozen beside the truck door, keys still clenched in his hand, his face drained white. About 24 years old, the only person in that entire yard who wasn't holding anything that could be used as a weapon. "Take him away," Santino said. The young man stood there for 2 seconds before understanding that someone had just allowed him to live. He ran over, slipped his arms under the other man's shoulders, dragged him toward the truck cab, and never once dared to lift his eyes. Santino didn't ask his name. He took off his own coat, placed it around Caitlin's shoulders, and led her to the car. On the drive back, the car followed the highway south, and Caitlin sat in the back seat looking through the window for 40 minutes without saying anything. She asked him why he had brought only 3 men. Santino said because if he brought 10, Boston would know 2 hours in advance, but with 3, they would only know when it was already too late. She asked how he had found the warehouse. He said that for 20 years the Boston branch had used only 3 places, and the other 2 were too close to the main roads. She said she had left the note so he wouldn't have to come. He said he knew. Then he said the one sentence she would remember for many years afterward. After tonight, he won't stop anymore. By the time they reached Newport, it was after 9 o'clock at night. The gates were already open. Walter Quinn was waiting on the front steps with her mother, and Helen was holding onto his arm without anyone having to tell her to. But that wasn't the first thing Caitlin noticed when she stepped into the foyer. Every person in the house was standing along both sides of the hallway, exactly as they had that afternoon in March, when she had pushed the cart of clean linens past them. There was only one difference. This time, they lowered their heads when she walked by. 3 days passed and nothing happened, and that was exactly what kept Santino Ferraro from sleeping. He doubled the men at the gates, changed the driving routes, and moved 2 meetings out of Providence. He prepared for something that would come straight at him. Arthur Sable didn't come from the front. On Saturday morning, Walter Quinn drove the Old House pickup truck down to the Newport docks to collect 2 crates that had been ordered the week before, something he had done twice every month for 42 years, alone, without anyone accompanying him, because as he always said, what kind of bodyguard did an old man need just to pick up supplies? At 9:15, there was an explosion near Pier Number 4. The call reached the house at 9:18. Santino was there at 9:31. The wooden planks of the dock were still wet with night dew that hadn't had time to dry, and Walter Quinn lay on his side beside the first crate he had managed to unload. He was still conscious. Santino dropped to both knees on those wet boards and took the old man's hand. Someone said the ambulance was coming. Someone said 7 more minutes. Walter told him not to kneel there, because he would ruin his trousers. Santino didn't get up. The old man asked whether the supplies were all right. Santino said they were. Walter said good, because there was paprika in there that he had ordered specially, the right kind, not the kind they always sent by mistake. He lay still for a while, breathing, then asked whether Santino had called the house yet, and told him not to let the older woman in the kitchen see the ambulance and panic, because her heart was weak. Santino said he had already taken care of it. Walter told him to make sure no one raised their voice in the kitchen either. The ambulance arrived at 9:40. They did everything they were supposed to do on the way to the hospital, and Santino sat beside the stretcher for the entire ride, still holding the old man's hand. And Walter Quinn said 2 more things during the final 40 minutes of his life. The first was about the scarecrow in the backyard. "Don't take it down yet," he said. "Birds are clever. Every year they come back to test you." The second thing he said came at 5 minutes to 10, when his eyes had begun to drift to one side, and the hand resting inside Santino's had grown suddenly light. He said nothing about Santino's father. He gave no instructions about the house, said nothing about how Santino should live, said nothing that could ever be carved onto a gravestone. He simply turned his head, looked at the 38-year-old man kneeling beside the stretcher, and asked him one question. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" Santino said yes. Walter said good. Then he was gone. There were 3 other people in the ambulance besides the 2 of them. All 3 later told the story the same way, that Mr. Ferraro didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, didn't change his expression. They said he kept holding that hand for a while longer, then placed it down very carefully, the way someone sets down something fragile. Then he stood up, and as he stood, he had to reach out and grip the side of the ambulance. He held on for 4 seconds, his knuckles white, his head lowered slightly, looking at no one. 4 seconds. Then he let go, straightened his collar, and stepped out of the ambulance with his usual steady stride. In 7 years, no one who worked for Santino Ferraro had ever seen him need something to hold on to. All 3 of those people later said that those 4 seconds frightened them more than anything they had ever seen him do. Back at the house, Helen Marchetti sat at the kitchen table with the plastic basket of garlic in front of her, and she didn't peel a single clove. She had heard the telephone ring and had counted the number of people running through the hallway. When Caitlin came into the kitchen, Helen asked only one question: whether he had been able to call anyone. Caitlin said she didn't know. Helen nodded, then pushed the basket of garlic aside and said that was enough. They weren't cooking today. Santino returned to Newport close to noon. He walked straight through the foyer, down the hallway, past everyone standing there waiting for him to say something, and not one of them dared ask. He didn't go upstairs to the study. He went out to the backyard. Caitlin saw him through the kitchen window. He stood in the corner of the yard beside the tomato beds, left dead from the previous season, in front of a scarecrow made from 2 crossed pieces of wood, dressed in an old faded suit jacket, soaked through from several days of rain. He stood there for about 10 minutes, his arms hanging at his sides, not touching it, not adjusting anything. Then he turned and went back inside. That evening, he called Caitlin up to the study and said exactly 3 things to her. He said Walter had gone to collect supplies, alone, on a Saturday morning, the way he had done every month for 42 years. He said whoever had done this knew that. Then he said this wasn't her fault, and he said it before she could even open her mouth, as though he already knew those were the words she was about to say. Caitlin stood there for a very long time. She said that 3 days earlier Walter had asked her whether she knew how to pickle green tomatoes, and she had said she didn't, and he had told her that one day when they had time, he would teach her. Then she said she wanted to go say goodbye to him. Santino said 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon, St. Columba Cemetery. She asked whether Walter had any family left. Santino looked down at the desk, and it took him about 5 seconds to answer such a simple question. No, he said. He didn't have anyone. At 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon at St. Columba Cemetery, more people came than Caitlin had expected. Men from 3 branches sent flowers. 2 vendors from the marina came and stood at the outer edge of the gathering, and no one introduced them to anyone. Caitlin arrived 10 minutes late with her mother, because Helen moved very slowly along the gravel path, and by the time the 2 women reached the grave, the service was already over. Caitlin laid down the bouquet, straightened, and remained there for a long time after everyone else had gone. She thought about the 3 rules the man beneath that fresh earth had taught her on her first day, and she realized that all 3 of those rules had been ways of protecting other people, not protecting the house. Then she thought about her own situation, and she thought about it clearly, without tears. Running was no longer an option because she had tried that for 3 years, and the result was that a man who had nothing to do with her was now lying beneath newly turned soil. But staying like this was no different. In that house, she was a contract worker hired through a staffing company, and in Arthur Sable's eyes, she was merchandise worth an entire port route. And in the eyes of anyone looking to bargain, she was still something that could be placed on a table and traded. They had asked for her once in polite words. They would ask again. And the only reason she was still standing here wasn't any law at all. It was because one man had decided she would be, and a man could change his mind, or a man could die. Caitlin stood before the grave, and began to think of something. It came to her not as a wish, but as a calculation. The kind of calculation she had become used to making over the past 3 years, whenever she had to choose between medicine and rent. She thought about it the entire way home. She thought about it for 3 more nights, finding another flaw in it each night, and then finding a way to patch that flaw. And she told no one, not even her mother, especially not her mother. That same Sunday afternoon, nearly 37 miles away, in a hospital room in Fall River, a 55-year-old man lay with 3 broken ribs and a lung that had just been drained of fluid. Frank Doyle had survived because someone had dragged him into the cab of a truck and driven for 2 straight hours through the night. That person was 24 years old. His name was Cole Brennan, and he was the stepson of the woman Frank Doyle had married 16 years earlier. Cole's biological father died when he was 4. His mother married Frank when Cole was 8 because she needed a place to live and a name on the lease. He had watched her wear away, little by little, over the 12 years that followed, a little more each year, until she died at 49. And at her funeral, Frank Doyle stood in the front row accepting condolences. Cole had never been called a son in that house. He was called the kid, and the kid's job was to drive. On Sunday afternoon, Frank summoned all 3 boys into his hospital room. Ray Doyle was 29. Travis Doyle was 26. The 2 biological sons stood on the right side of the bed. Cole stood at the foot of it, closest to the door, as he always did. Frank didn't talk about his health. The first thing he asked was which one of them had sold information to Ferraro. No one answered. He said forget it, they would deal with that later. Then he said he had worked for Boston for 30 years, and no one in Providence had ever dared lay a hand on him, and that on that night in South Boston, 4 men had seen him lying on the ground, and there was no amount of money that could wash that away. He told his 2 biological sons to go to Newport. Bring me Ferraro's head, he said. Ray asked when. Frank said as soon as possible, then added that all 3 of them were going. Cole looked up. He said he didn't know how to use a gun. He had never held a real gun in his hands, had never fired a single shot, not even at a can. Frank looked at him with the same expression he had been giving him for 16 years. He has to grow up sometime, he said. Then he turned to Ray and told him to teach him, and said that if Cole couldn't shoot, then he could sit in the car and keep the engine running, because his job was only driving anyway. Travis laughed. Ray didn't. And Ray was the only person in the room who noticed that Cole's hand was clenched tightly around the metal rail at the foot of the hospital bed. Cole said nothing more. That night he sat alone in the cab of the truck parked outside the hospital, and he thought about the concrete yard in South Boston, about the 3 seconds that man had stood looking at Frank Doyle without doing anything, and about the only words the man had spoken to him. Take him away. Cole had taken him, and now they were telling him to go back and take the head of the man who had allowed him to live. He sat in the truck until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, without turning on the lights, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and he didn't know that within 9 days, everything he thought he understood about that night in South Boston would turn out to be wrong. The ambush happened on Thursday night, on a stretch of Bellevue about 1/4 of a mile from the gates of the estate, where the trees blocked the streetlights. Ray Doyle chose that spot because he had driven past it 3 times in 2 days. What he didn't know was that Ferraro's men had counted all 3 passes. Cole sat in the cab of the truck parked 1 block away, his hands on the steering wheel, the engine already running, exactly as he had been assigned. Through the handheld radio, he heard Ray begin the countdown. Then he heard 1 gunshot, then several more, overlapping one another, far shorter than he had imagined it would be. The entire thing lasted less than 20 seconds. After that, the radio went silent. Cole called twice, then 3 times, calling each man by name. No one answered. He remained in the cab for another 4 minutes, and those 4 minutes were the longest stretch of time he had ever lived through up to that point. Then he shut off the engine and walked out. The Rhode Island State Police arrived before he did. Cole didn't go closer. He stood beyond the perimeter behind the small crowd of onlookers, watched 2 stretchers being wheeled out, watched the way the sheets were pulled over them, and understood everything from the simple fact that no one was in a hurry. The following morning, he went to the medical examiner's office in Providence to make the identification. They asked how he was related to the 2 men. Cole stood there for a moment before saying, "Brothers, same mother, different fathers." They gave him a form to sign, and a plastic bag containing their personal belongings, and inside Ray's bag was a house key Cole recognized immediately, because it was the key to the back door of the house in Fall River, where his mother had spent the final 12 years of her life. He held that key in his hand for the entire drive back to the hospital. He thought about how long Ray had kept it, and why he had kept it. Because Ray was the one who had sold that house in the 2nd month after their mother's funeral. Cole found no answer. and it was the first time in his life he felt sorrow for a man he had never even liked. Frank Doyle already knew before Cole walked into the room. He was sitting propped against 3 pillows, his face gray, and he didn't ask what had happened. He asked, "Why the hell are you still alive?" Cole said he had stayed in the truck, just like Frank told him to. Frank said, "I told you to stay in the truck. I didn't tell you to sit there while your brothers died." Cole said he didn't have a gun. Frank said, "You don't have any guts either." Then he said the words he had been holding on to for 16 years. "You're not my son," he said. "Your mother brought some bastard kid home and made me raise him, and I raised you, and this is what I get in return." Cole stood at the foot of the bed, where he had always stood, closest to the door. He didn't raise his voice. "You were never my father," he said. "My father died when I was 4. You were just the man I watched torment my mother until she finally died." Frank cursed at him. He reached for something on the bedside table to throw, but couldn't reach it. He said, "I'll find you." Cole said, "You won't find anybody. You're breathing with 1 lung. Frank said, "Then I'll send someone else." Cole said, "What someone else?" "Your 2 sons just died because of an order you gave while lying flat on your back in a hospital bed." Then he turned and walked out, but he didn't leave directly. He drove to Fall River first, opened the back door with the very key from the plastic bag, and went into the rear room, where Frank Doyle kept a box of papers beneath a cabinet. Cole knew the place because for 16 years he had been the one who carried that cabinet every time they moved. There were 3 ledgers in the box, 2 recorded loans and interest, written in ugly, smudged handwriting. The third was thicker, with a blue plastic cover, and Frank Doyle called it the workbook. In it, he had recorded every job he had done for Boston, over 30 years, 1 line for each job, with the date, the location, the amount of money, and the name of the person who had paid him. No line said what the job actually was. Frank Doyle had no reason to write that down, because he only did one kind of work. He didn't keep the ledger because he was careful. He kept it because it was the thing that kept him alive, the thing he would bring out if Boston ever turned against him. Cole sat down on the floor and began flipping backward from the end. He went through this year, last year, the year before that. Then he stopped at an entry dated March 14th, 3 years earlier. The location was an underground parking garage on Dorrance Street in Providence. Beside it were 2 initials Cole didn't understand, and an amount of money larger than every other figure on that page. And in the final column, the one listing the name of the person who had paid, there was a name written in blue ink, clearly, without abbreviation. Cole read that name 3 times. He didn't know who the person was. He only knew one thing for certain, that for the past several weeks he had heard everyone in the Doyle family say over and over that everything came from Boston, from Arthur Sable, from an order out of Back Bay. The name in the ledger wasn't Arthur Sable. Late one November afternoon, in the great sitting room overlooking the bay through 3 walls of glass, Caitlin Bell walked in at nearly 5 o'clock, after standing in the hallway for more than a minute, going over one last time everything she was about to say. She wasn't wearing an apron. That was the only unusual detail, and Santino Ferraro noticed it the moment he looked up. She said she had a proposal, and she hoped he would hear her all the way through before answering. He folded the paper he was reading and told her to go ahead. Caitlin stood about 10 feet away from him, both arms hanging straight at her sides, and began with the sentence she had practiced for 3 nights in a row. "I'm proposing that you marry me," she said. She immediately told him this wasn't about feelings, that she wasn't asking for his affection, and that she had considered it the same way she would consider a contract. Then she gave him her first reason. She said that in America, a wife couldn't be forced to testify in court against her husband, and that if the day ever came when her father's ledger was brought into the light, she couldn't be used against this house itself. Santino let her finish that sentence. Then he said that wasn't correct. Caitlin faltered. He stood, walked toward the glass wall, and said she was referring to something that had been changed in 1980. He said trammel. He said that under that case, the spousal privilege belonged to the person called to testify, not to the other spouse, which meant that if she were called into court and wanted to testify, he had no right to stop her, and it also meant that anyone who wanted to use her against him could still do so. "The law won't save you, Miss Bell," he said. "You calculated wrong." He asked where she had read it. Caitlin said in an old law book at the Providence Public Library. Santino said the book had been printed before 1980. Caitlin was silent for quite a while. Then she said, "All right, forget the first half." There was still the second half. She said that in his world, no one would dare touch his wife. She said that for 3 years she had been a name on a list, something that could be traded, and everyone sitting around a table in Boston knew that trading a hired worker was cheap. But taking the wife of a man who led the council would carry a price no one could afford, And that protection didn't come from the laws of the United States. It came from his own laws. In return, she said, he would have the ledger, the hard drive, everything her father had left behind, and she would do whatever he needed. She said she knew what the proposal sounded like. She said she was 27 years old and had never imagined that the first marriage proposal of her life would sound like someone reading clauses from a contract. Then she stated her condition. I have only one condition, she said, and I won't trade it for anything. My mother lives out the rest of her life in this house. She has her medicine, someone to care for her, and a doctor who comes here when she needs one. And no one in this house is ever allowed to look at her as though she were a servant. Santino didn't answer immediately. He stood in silence for so long that Caitlin could hear the clock out in the foyer. Then he turned toward her and opened his mouth to speak. The glass wall behind her shattered. It didn't break into scattered pieces. It collapsed inward as a single sheet, pouring into the room like water. And at the same moment, 4 men came through the empty frame from the garden outside. Santino pulled Caitlin down behind the long sofa, pushed her flat against the floor, then rose. He didn't call for anyone. Not one of his men managed to enter the room during the next 90 seconds. He did everything himself, and he did it the same way he did everything else, without rushing, without shouting once, moving in short, decisive bursts between sheets of glass that were still falling around him. Caitlin pressed herself against the floor and counted 3 brief silences between the blasts. At the 4th, she lifted her head and saw the last man standing in the blind corner behind Santino, in a place he couldn't turn quickly enough to see. She didn't think. She sprang up, ran across the floor strewn with broken glass, and drove her whole body into his shoulder. There was another blast. Her left arm flared hot, then went numb, and then everything stopped. Gunsmoke hung in the fading evening light. Broken glass covered the wooden floor in a white layer so thick that every step made a sound. The curtains whipped inward, because the wind from the bay was blowing straight through the empty wall frame. Santino turned around. He looked down at the sleeve of her dress, where the fabric was torn and soaked dark. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He could already see the answer. In 7 years, many people had taken bullets for him, and every one of them had been on his payroll. The woman standing in front of him now, her hands still trembling, her feet bare, hadn't been paid a single dollar to do what she had just done. He straightened amid the broken glass, then leaned slightly toward her and held out his hand, and he smiled. It was the first time in all 8 months she had lived in that house, and according to people who had worked there far longer than she had, the first time in many years. Miss Marchetti, he said, calling her by her true last name for the first time. I accept, but I'm changing one clause. Take out the part where you say you'll do whatever I need. I don't buy people. Cole Brennan came to the gates of the Ferraro estate 2 days later on foot, both hands raised, and told the guard that he was the kid who had driven the truck in South Boston. They let him in. He placed the blue plastic-covered ledger on the desk in the study, opened it to the page whose corner he had folded, then stepped back and said nothing more. Santino read the entry. March 14th, 3 years earlier, an underground parking garage on Dorrance Street, Providence. The amount of money, and in the final column, the name of the person who had paid, Elliot Vance. He read it a second time, then called someone in and ordered them to bring up every record from the council's common fund for the past 7 years. By midnight, everything was spread across the desk. For 7 years, Providence's contribution to the council's common fund had always passed through the hands of one man, and the amount leaving Newport had always been larger than the amount arriving in Hartford. Not by much, a little each time. Added together across 7 years, it became a sum no one could survive having placed before the council. The only person in the world capable of putting those 2 numbers side by side was the man who kept the books for all 5 branches. Paul Marchetti had put them side by side in the spring 3 years earlier. 2 weeks later, he died in a parking garage, and 3 years after that, the very man who had paid for it was the man who sat in this study and suggested handing Paul's daughter over to Boston, using the exact words Arthur Sable would use in Back Bay 11 days later. Santino closed the ledger. He asked Cole why he hadn't sold it. Cole said because of that night in South Boston. Santino told Cole he would sleep here tonight, and then he thanked him. And it was the first time in Cole Brennan's life that a grown man had ever said those words to him. Caitlin stood in the doorway of the study through the latter part of the evening. When only the 2 of them were left, she said there was one more thing she hadn't told him. She took a piece of paper folded into quarters from her pocket, softened almost to cloth along the creases, and placed it on the desk. She said this had been inside the envelope, stuck to the inside of the flap, and she hadn't shown it to anyone in 3 years. Santino opened it. It was Paul Marchetti's handwriting, written in haste, 5 lines. He had written that if she received this, it meant he had made a mistake somewhere. He had written not to trust the police, not to trust lawyers, not to trust anyone who called her before she called them. Then he had written the final 2 lines. Of all 5 branches, only 1 man refused his share of dirty money. Go there, and don't tell him who you are. Santino finished reading and sat in silence. He asked how long she had known about this house. Kaylin said since the 3rd day after the funeral. She said it had taken her 2 years and 7 months to work her way through 3 different staffing companies, working without pay in 2 places, just to build a record clean enough to make it onto the employment list for this house. She said that the night she walked through those gates in March, she hadn't been lucky at all. Then she said that was why she had lied to him the day he asked whether her father had ever mentioned the Ferraro name. Santino sat very still for a long time. For 8 months, he had believed he was the one making every decision. Believed he was the one who had allowed a thief to stay, who had pulled a woman out of a warehouse in South Boston. It turned out that the man who had sent her here had been dead for 3 years, and that man had chosen Santino, with 1 hurried line of writing, based on the one thing all 5 branches knew about him, and no one considered important. He managed only 1 question. What year did your father write that line? Caitlin said my father wrote it 2 weeks before he died. The next morning, they sat in the kitchen with the leather-bound notebook open to page 43. Cole sat at the corner of the table. The notebook was still a jumble of meaningless numbers because the final 4 pages had been cut out with a knife. Santino said that without those 4 pages, the council wouldn't believe a single word of it. Helen Marchetti was standing at the sink with her back to them, drying a cup. She set the cup down. Then she said, very casually, the way someone might mention groceries, that those 4 pages weren't missing at all. All 3 of them turned toward her. She came to the table with the help of her cane, sat down, and said her husband had been too afraid to write them down. She said that during the final 6 weeks, every night he would make her sit down and listen while he read them aloud to her, a little at a time, then make her repeat them back so he could check. She said she had asked him whether writing them down wouldn't be faster. He told her paper could be burned, but no one paid attention to an old woman's memory. She said he had ordered her never to tell their daughter, because if the girl knew her mother was carrying all of that inside her head, she would never again dare let her mother out of her sight. Caitlin couldn't say a word. Helen asked whether anyone had paper and a pencil. Cole handed her the school notebook and a pencil. She held the pencil in her right hand while her left remained resting on the handle of her cane, and she began reading aloud as she wrote, slowly and evenly, in the voice of the 22-year-old woman who had once sat recording numbers at an insurance company on Westminster Street. 47 account numbers, each one accompanied by a 3-letter code. She recited them all in 26 minutes, without stopping once to remember, without getting a single digit wrong. And when she finished writing the final line, she put the pencil down and asked everyone whether anyone was eating lunch that day. The council of the 5 New England branches met 10 days later at an old hotel in Hartford, and it was the first time in 11 years that all 5 men had sat down at the same table. Santino Ferraro brought no accusation with him. He placed Paul Marchetti's leather-bound ledger on the table beside 4 pages copied in pencil onto sheets torn from a school notebook, and he simply read. He read the figure the Boston branch had reported to the council over the course of 10 years. Then he read the real figure, matched to every account, every code, every date. No one interrupted him. Arthur Sable sat with his back straight, his tie drawn tight as always, and he didn't argue a single point, because to argue he would have had to produce another number, while the other 4 branches were already holding his own numbers in their hands. The laws of the council had been built 30 years earlier by him and men like him, and now those laws dealt with him exactly as they had always dealt with everyone else. Santino didn't have to do anything more. He simply opened the ledger and let the system consume the man who had lived off it longer than anyone. Elliot Vance was different. Santino met with him alone in the study in Newport, with no one else in the room. Vance talked a great deal. He talked about 7 years, about the nights he had stayed awake, cleaning up problems for this family, about how he had never once allowed Santino to lose face before the council. Santino let him finish. Then he said exactly 3 things. Mister, Walter taught me how to tie my shoes. You worked for me for 7 years. Get out. The study door closed behind him, and that was the last time the name Elliot Vance was ever spoken in that house. Cole Brennan didn't remain in Newport. He took Frank Doyle's blue plastic-covered ledger to the Federal Bureau of Investigation office in Providence and spent 4 days giving a statement about a contract killing that had taken place on March 14th, 3 years earlier. He signed the statement with his real name. They asked whether he was afraid. Cole said he had been afraid for 16 years already. Afterward, he left New England and went to Vermont, where he worked nights as a security guard at a lumber mill while studying for certification, then applied to the police force of a small town whose entire population was smaller than the number of people who had attended Walter Quinn's funeral. 6 years later, he was a detective. People said he was a rare kind of police officer, the kind willing to listen to someone's entire story before asking the first question. It took Santino Ferraro exactly 2 years to pull his family out of every illegal operation in New England and move everything into ports, logistics, and real estate. He didn't do it because he had become a good man. He did it because, for the first time in his life, he had something he couldn't bear the thought of losing. He never took down the scarecrow in the old suit jacket at the corner of the backyard. That spring, he had tomatoes planted again in the exact same place, and the woman who taught him how to tie the vines was his mother-in-law. Caitlin donated one of her kidneys to her mother the following spring at Rhode Island Hospital, a living donor transplant from daughter to mother, one of the most common and yet least spoken about acts inside operating rooms across America. Helen Marchetti lived another 9 years. Every morning, she still came down to the kitchen and sat peeling garlic, even though the house had more than enough people to do it for her. And whenever someone told her to rest, she said her hands got lonely when they had nothing to do. Their wedding took place in the backyard, in the very corner where Walter Quinn had once grown tomatoes, with 22 guests and not a single reporter. Caitlin wore the simplest white dress she could find. Near the end of the meal, when almost everyone had gone home, she stood and began clearing the table out of the habit of 3 years spent cleaning houses, and no one managed to stop her in time. Santino Ferraro didn't stop her. He picked up a dish towel, walked over, and stood beside his wife. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. No job can make a human being lesser. Only the way we treat one another can do that. A person's worth isn't measured by how much work they can still perform, because sometimes the person the entire world sees as a burden is the very person carrying in their memory the one thing that can save everyone. And what defined these two people wasn't who saved whom, because the truth is, they didn't save each other. They simply did one very simple thing that no one in that entire world of power seemed capable of doing. They looked at each other and saw a human being. If today you are doing work that other people look down on, or caring for someone society has decided no longer has value, I hope you remember that a person's dignity has never lived in the eyes of other people. How did this story make you feel? And did you see yourself, or someone you love, somewhere inside it? Leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly want to hear what is in your heart. If this story touched you, please give it a like and share it with someone you think may need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can hear more compelling stories every day. We wish every one of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in your heart each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.